All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 8th Disability Research and Education in Academic Medicine, or DREAM Research Rounds. My name is Dr. Zoe Sheets, and I'm a member of the Meeks Research Lab, as well as the Docs with Disabilities Initiative Advisory Committee. And I'm also a doctor with a disability starting residency in June. The DREAM Consortium is part of the Docs with Disabilities Initiative, and it's focused on 4 areas. First, to create, mentor, and grow a robust community of scholars focused on advancing disability inclusion research in academic medicine. Second, to highlight and promote this research. And third, to identify and address gaps in disability data. And finally, to connect researchers and stakeholders to promote cross-cultural collaboration. It is my pleasure to introduce you to both of today's speakers. Dr. Philip Zazove, who's the retired chair of family medicine at the University of Michigan, who has spent his entire career committed to improving the life and healthcare access of people with disabilities. And Dr. Katy Stauffer, who is an incoming resident in physical medicine and rehabilitation at the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center this summer. And they'll be speaking to you about the progress or lack thereof, research on technical standards 2016 to 2022. I'll let them take it away.
Thank you, everybody. We're very happy to be here. Our title, we're going to be talking today about the progress or lack thereof regarding technical standards. And we're going to compare some data from, let's say 2016, it's really 2015, I believe, and 2022. And at the end, we're going to have plenty of time for questions, and we're hoping for a robust discussion. We'll go to the next slide. And this is just some of the supporters and entities that are supporting the Docs with Disabilities Initiative. So let's go to the next slide. The whole objective today, there are actually 3 of them. First, to understand the history and current landscape of medical school admissions for students with disabilities and how technical standards fit into the application and matriculation process. Technical standards are the standards medical schools use to decide whether an applicant meets the minimum criteria for admission to practice medicine, separate from grades and MCAT and recommendations. And we'll talk more about that. Second objective is to articulate the current challenges that students with disabilities face when it comes to technical standards, including discriminatory language and unclear messaging surrounding accommodation. And the third objective is to discuss best practices for both evaluating as well as updating technical standards, and talk about what we call functional technical standards, the functional framework, and giving you some recently published resources on this topic. Again, we're going to have plenty of time for discussion afterwards, but please ask questions if you have any. So why is this important? Well, you can tell from my speech that I'm deaf, and I can tell you a little bit about that later, but studies have shown that people who look or act or are part of a culture with their patients tend to do a better job. In this case, physicians with disabilities are more empathetic with patients with disabilities and appear more likely to care for patients with disabilities. The AAMC actually has a principle that physicians should resemble the patients as much as possible. And this has to do with race and gender and religion and sexual preference and disabilities. Traditionally, we've had what we call organic technical standards. Organic technical standards say the student must have the required physical attributes. For example, the student must hear, the student must see, The student must be able to run down the floor. That discriminates against students with disabilities, particularly with other technology we have now. Also, in many cases, it's illegal under the mandate of the ADA. And it's based on the misconception that if a physician has disabilities, it increases the risk to patients. And there's absolutely unequivocally no data that supports that happens at all. In fact, some data to suggest the patients get better care if they have somebody who looks or is like them. Let's go to the next slide. So we talked a little bit about some of the barriers that students with disabilities have. There's a failure to see the value in the students with disabilities. We mentioned that people with disabilities tend to take care and better care of people who have disabilities. There are outdated and discriminatory technical standards. Those are the so-called organic technical standards. They don't take into account any of today's technology. There's the assumptions about performance, the assumption that if you have a disability, you're not going to be able to perform as well, and you put the patient at risk. There's a bias in the admission committee decisions. Many people on the admission committee, particularly older physicians who tend to be on the committee, often don't understand what accommodation can do these days. What technology has allowed actually a revolution in the research and accommodations available to people with disabilities. And so they discriminate because they use organic technical standards. And then there's the uninviting forward-facing messages. Think about the message it gives when people with disabilities are continually put down, and what it means to the other people in the class who don't have equals with disabilities, so they have different opinions. Let's go to the next slide. So, how many people with disabilities are in medical education? For a long time, the number was around 2%. In 2020, it's 7.6% of students being admitted to a disability. And in 2021, it was 8.3%. And that's in AAMC data. This is still grossly underrepresented, representative of the number of Americans with disabilities. For example, here in Alaska alone, 17% of Americans have that. And there's probably at least 30 or more percent of Americans have a disability. And about 7.5% of residents have disabilities. So again, these are students with disabilities are grossly underrepresented, despite the efforts that have been made in the last 5 years. Next slide, please. So back in 2015, 2016, after we started in 2014 at Michigan, we did a study to look at technical standards. We got information from every single medical school, MD and DO, in the United States to assess their approach to technical standards. What's the availability that students could find the technical standards of that medical school? And if it was there, how easy was it to find? And then we looked at the technical standards that we got, which we got from most medical schools, to look at the willingness to accept reasonable accommodation under the ADA, the locus of responsibility for providing the accommodations, whether it's the student or the school, and the acceptability of certain accommodations, such as a motorized scooter or a sign language interpreter. And we tried to figure factors associated with ADA compliance among those schools. And we focused mainly on physical disabilities, hearing, vision, mobility, because it's much more difficult and it's less clear right now what psychiatric and intellectual disabilities could include. And we did what's called a document analysis of technical standards, and I can talk about that later if people are interested, but it's a certain process. We developed a coding team and to analyze the content of our technical standards. And we had two researchers independently code the data and then make sure that the coding was congruent. The book was published in Academic Medicine in 2016 and got a huge amount of visibility. And I'm going to, in the next slide, start telling you some of the findings. 14% of schools did not even publicize the technical standards, and we couldn't find it. And we even wrote to the schools and asked them those we couldn't find online, and we ended up with 14% that never provided the technical standards. Only a third of medical schools explicitly were willing to accommodate students with disabilities. Now, this is back in 2015. And another third, we did find the technical standards, but they were very difficult to locate. Spent many minutes, sometimes a half an hour before we found the technical standards. And so a student applying who wants to know what that school requires had a very hard time finding that out. The next slide. Just about 60% of medical schools did not tell the student applicant on their website who has responsibility for providing the accommodation. The ADA says the school has the responsibility, very clear. One school actually said outright, the student is totally responsible for providing and paying for the accommodation, which is totally illegal. I'm happy to say, by the way, that school changed after our publication. Over 90% of schools said that intermediaries, such as sign language interpreters, are not allowed. A good friend of mine, who is an internist hospitalist at the University of Texas, Austin, uses interpreters 24/7. He's actually a residency director too. So the fact that over 90% of schools explicitly prescribe this, it was worrisome. 60% of schools did not allow auxiliary aid. In other words, 40% did, such as motor scooters. And this on the right is just the first page of our publication. Okay, let's go to the next slide, please. So we looked at the schools who were supportive of technical standards and compared them to the schools who were not supportive. And those who were supportive, who explicitly said they were supportive, were much more likely to allow reasonable accommodation, much more likely to say that they were responsible, and much more likely to accept intermediaries. The schools who were supportive and the schools who were not supportive showed no difference in whether you could use auxiliary aid, whether they were public or private, whether they're MD or DO schools, except DO schools were more likely to accept support for students with mobility problems. Next slide. So that was published in 2015 or 2016, and I know that many schools contacted me, had questions, and I know of several schools who changed their technical standards to be more consistent with the ADA. So I'm going to turn it over now to Katy, who's going to talk about a more recent study, a follow-up study, and what that found.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Zazove. So as Dr. Zazove mentioned, after their study was published, we were kind of asking the question, are schools taking the recommendations made in that 2016 study, and are they applying them to their technical standards? And for me personally, I just recently graduated from a medical school that was a new medical school. I was part of the second graduating class. And as I was filling out, going through the technical standards and reading phrases like the applicant must be able to stand for prolonged periods of time, the applicant must be able to hear and to speak with patients and their family members. Looking at it from an accessibility framework, I realized that students with disabilities might not be able to sign the technical standards in good faith, but that doesn't mean that they wouldn't be good physicians. And so that kind of led me on a path to looking into this topic more. I found the study by Dr. Zazove, and I asked the question, maybe medical schools that have been around for a long time are using outdated language when they're compiling their technical standards. Maybe they just haven't edited their technical standards. But if we have new medical schools, they should be using these new recommendations, this new data to show that they should be having more inclusive technical standards. And I wanted to ask, is that in fact the case? So what we did was we looked at 15 new medical schools, 10 MD and 5 DO across the country. And we applied the same framework that the Zazove study had come up with, and we asked the same questions. And so what we found was that, unfortunately, even new medical schools are still using outdated language in their technical standards. There haven't been a ton of improvements since the original study was published. One positive was that we were able to find all 15 technical standards online. So they were available, but 73% of them were at least moderately difficult to find. So we were still having technical standards that were buried within multiple submenus, or sometimes were even behind a login, so that a prospective student may not be able to access the technical standards until they actually had a login with the institution. Again, this is a barrier because if it's a student who is trying to figure out if this school is going to be welcoming, or if maybe they use a screen reader or some sort of assistive device, putting the technical standards kind of buried on the website just makes it even harder for them to get that information and see if this is a school that might be welcoming to them. Unfortunately, only 13% of the schools in our new study use supportive language in their technical standards. A few of them had phrases that said that they welcomed applicants with disabilities, but most of them were not supportive. In fact, 53% were actually coded as restrictive. So they would have a phrase or sometimes multiple phrases that would signal to an applicant with a disability that they might not be welcomed at the institution. Phrases saying that, the technical standards cannot be altered without fundamentally risking the well-being and safety of patients. Things that we know from the data are not true. Students with disabilities do not put their patients at risk, but they still included this language in their technical standards. And then 100% of the schools did share responsibility for providing accommodations if accommodations were allowed. So the onus was on the student to disclose their disability. And then if the technical standards mentioned accommodations, they would say that the school and the student would work together to find appropriate accommodations. About 67% of the schools in this new study did not allow or did not appear to allow for some form of hearing or mobility aids. And some of the schools outright barred intermediaries such as sign language interpreters. So taking these two studies and the results kind of as a whole, stepping back, what are some of the takeaways? And I think first it bears repeating many times that it's quite feasible to train medical students with disabilities. We've seen through all levels of medical training, whether medical school, residency, or as attending physicians with disabilities are great physicians, and they represent an important subset of the patient population. And so we need their experience, and we need to help make a path to practicing physicians for students with disabilities. Again, many technical standards, even some of these new ones, still violate the ADA. Not allowing for even the discussion about having an intermediary or an auxiliary aid is in violation of the ADA, and schools have had almost 30 years to update their standard, or in the case of the second study, to write new standards that are compliant with the ADA. In terms of future research, one of the critiques that we receive from both studies is that the lived experience of a student may not be reflected in the technical standards. So there may be a school with restrictive technical standards where a student with a disability is actually really doing well and is accepted and is using accommodations. But the point is that if the technical standards are one of the first things a prospective applicant sees from the school, and if those standards are restrictive or if they use language that isn't welcoming for a student with a disability, then that student may feel like they don't have the space to get the accommodations they need, or even worse, they might not apply at all. And so again, this is about reducing the barriers for students with disabilities and showing them that they're welcome in medicine. And then finally, a reevaluation and a modernization is needed of technical standards. So again, whether that's taking a look at your own school or program's technical standards and making sure that the language is inclusive, that it allows for accommodations and intermediaries and the discussion about those things, or whether it's writing brand new technical standards using best practices, we need to kind of do a revamp. So some considerations when revising technical standards, there is an LCME element 10.5, and that can be used to help when crafting or editing technical standards. So the Office of Civil Rights makes a recommendation that technical standards should be readily available to applicants and students. The technical standards should be up to date in that they rely on current best practices and current technologies. For example, the COVID-19 pandemic has showed us all that medical education can be delivered in different and innovative ways. And so thinking about how we can use these new technologies, whether it's an amplified stethoscope, whether it's technology that exists already like power wheelchairs, we should be reflecting these technological updates in our technical standards. And then finally, thinking about what skills are truly essential for a medical student to be able to perform, and thinking about what things can be cut out of technical standards is another important discussion that we'll get into in just a few slides. There was also a 2021 recommendation from the AMA and the Council on Medical Education, and they basically say two main things. First, that medical schools or residency programs should review and revise their technical standards to focus on replacing organic standards with functional standards. And again, we'll talk about that coming up in a minute. The second thing is that they should make sure these standards are readily available to students and to prospective students, and they should put them on their website alongside a link to information about how a student could request accommodations for disabilities. These things should be displayed prominently on their websites. So when we talk about functional and organic technical standards, what exactly do we mean? In the past, even back as far as the 1970s, some of the accrediting boards, so the LCME or the COCA for DO schools, have published basically sample technical standards. And in those, they used now outdated organic technical standards. These focus on how a student should perform a task. So by extension, if a student has a disability, the technical standards highlight the physical deficits rather than focusing on their ability to do work. So what makes more sense now, and what's been recommended in many works of literature and papers, is that we should be adopting functional technical standards. These focus on what students can do, not necessarily how they do it. And again, the hope is that if we are focusing on what students ultimately can do, then we're making more space for students with differing levels of abilities and different workarounds to be able to achieve the same goals, despite the different paths they might take to get there. And this is important because as our population ages, as we have more patients with disabilities, we need to have physicians who reflect our patient population. A couple of examples to help solidify this idea. So again, organic technical standards focus on how a person does a task. So the first example, the applicant must be able to hear heart and lung sounds. So that word hear would suggest that deaf or hard of hearing students wouldn't be able to complete the technical standard. However, if we look over to the functional side, a better way we could phrase this requirement would be to say the applicant must be able to obtain the pertinent information about heart and lung sounds. And so this provides space if a student needs to hear an amplified or use an amplified stethoscope, if maybe they need to look at the waveforms of the heart sounds, of the lung sounds. It basically makes allowance for them to get the information they need to interpret these like vital exam maneuvers, but it doesn't specify how they have to do it. Again, an organic standard would say something like the candidate must have both physical and mental endurance to adapt to extended periods of sitting and standing. And this could preclude someone in a wheelchair. It could preclude someone with chronic fatigue syndrome. But we know from plenty of physicians who have done it that there are great physicians who use a wheelchair for mobility. And that being in a wheelchair or needing to use a cane or needing to take scheduled breaks doesn't mean that someone couldn't be a great physician. And so again, it's better to shift kind of our framework. We could say something like candidates must be able to obtain and interpret information through a comprehensive assessment of patients. So this covers basically many of the tasks a physician would need to do. It covers taking a good history from a patient. It covers looking through the electronic medical records to gain more information. It covers doing a physical exam. But again, it doesn't specify how the student would be able to do those things, and it allows space for auxiliary aids, for accommodations, for intermediaries if necessary. So that kind of concludes our presentation portion of the talk. We'd like to open it up now for questions or opinions and experiences from the audience, so we can kind of discuss these topics in more depth.
Thank you to you both so much for. Go ahead, Dr. Zazove.
On the previous slide, the article by Laura Kiza et al. Is actually a white paper that I was on a committee by the American Physiatry Association, pretty comprehensive and had specific recommendations for what children should not be included as far as technical standards go, and including some suggestive language. So that might be a good reference for people who are interested.
Excellent. Thank you for that. And thank you both so much for an incredible presentation. I particularly appreciate the attention you paid to not only the legal expectations of having inclusive technical standards, but also the fact that doctors with disabilities have incredible strengths. And so technical standards being inclusive is something that matters not only to have empathetic and successful physicians, but also for patient outcomes for people with disabilities. As both Drs. Stauffer and Zazove just said, we're open for questions. I want to be sure everyone knows there is a question and answer button in the webinar at the bottom. There's also the chat where we've had a few questions, and I'll be monitoring both for anything that comes in. The first thing that I want to highlight is we had a question sort of towards the beginning when you were outlining the initial presentation, initial paper, excuse me, Dr. Zazove, asking, did every school participate in the 2016 research paper?
Yes and no. We looked at there were 185 schools at that time. We looked at everyone. There was a small number, I can't remember how many, I'm going to say 10 out of 185, somewhere in that ballpark, who did not respond to direct contact. Nothing on the website, and we sent them a letter as if we were a student, asking for a copy of the technical standards. A couple of schools answered, but those 10 did not. So 95% of the schools were included.
Great, thank you. There was also a question, and I know you just shared a resource as well, but specifically, is there anywhere to find guidance, or will you be providing guidance on the discussion of how to integrate intermediaries into technical standards.
That's a great question. And Katy, if you want to speak up, I'll let you talk. That's a great question. I'm going to get my thoughts on that. There's a misconception about what intermediaries are. Intermediaries are just what the word is. They're transitioning information from one to the other, just like the telephone does when you talk on the telephone. They don't make decisions. They don't say things that you don't say. They're just the intermediary. They're helping with communication. The misconception is that the intermediary doesn't do that. The intermediary may say things that are not true or that the doctor didn't say. I think the biggest problem with intermediaries is that misconception. I really do. The second problem that some people bring up is cost. Interestingly, when you look at the cost of almost all the accommodations available, they're relatively minor, considering how much money all academic health centers have, or big health systems. Intermediaries like sign language interpreters are probably potentially the most costly. Having said that, sign language, until recently at least, is the third most common language in the country after English and Spanish. Lots of people with that. And many of them don't get health care because they can't communicate with their doctors. Providing sign language intermediaries, for example, opens access to those schools. The school can get a boost in their payment by providing a certain percentage of uncompensated care. So, and the bottom line is, in the end, when all this stuff is put together, they're not that costly and potentially improve outcomes. Again, I would refer people, if you want details, to the paper by Laura Kezar, K-E-Z-A-R, in 2019, I think it was. But it's pretty comprehensive. It's a white paper about technical standards, and that can give you more references to back your case if you're trying to make a case for intermediaries at your school. Katy, I don't know if you have any additional comments.
Yeah, I think that was great. I would point people to this resource as well that's up on the slide. This is chapter 3 of this book on technical standards. I don't know if you can read kind of the small text in the introduction, but chapter 4 talks about crafting accommodations that adhere to the boundaries of technical standards. And so that chapter might also be a useful reference for that specific question of intermediaries or other accommodations.
Thank you. Just to make clear, this is the book Equal Access for Students with Disabilities, edited by Meeks, Jane, and Laird. The resource that Dr. Zazove mentioned earlier was graciously put in the chat as well for anyone looking for it. And then we had another comment stating, I'm wondering about how these types of technical standards impact other health professions, such as nurses or physical therapists.
I can.
It's a problem in health settings, medical professionals. I hear regularly from nurses, physical therapists, veterinarians about the same barriers that we have in medicine. They're the same technical standards that are organic. And it's interesting because there's a group called Association of Medical Professionals with Hearing Loss, for people with hearing loss, and there are victim therapists and nurses there who are totally deaf, who are very successful. As Katy said earlier, it's very doable. There are hundreds of us out there doing a great job, and yet these technical standards persist. And I'm going to reiterate, there is no data, absolutely no evidence that there's any malpractice or adverse risk to patient. So like the long answer, the short answer is yes, it applies to other health professionals.
Yeah, adding to that, someone just said in the chat, I'm glad the nursing question came up. Nursing programs seem very stuck on the idea that being able to lift a criterion weight is essential to successful nursing. We also have a question in the Q&A that offers a little bit of background before asking a question. It says, so far as I have been able to determine, there is no legal requirement that health professions schools publish technical standards. The term originates in the guidance published by the feds following the Rehab Act of 1973. The requirement as it pertains to medical schools was introduced by the LCME following the AAMC's 1979 definition of technical standards. Perhaps panelists know more about the history, or perhaps we could speak to what might replace technical standards as documents to provide anticipatory guidance and promote access to accommodations and how to go about it.
The AAMC has been very supportive of this whole concept of moving to functional or technical standards as the LCME. The problem is you can say one thing and mandate something, it's harder to make it happen. The study that Katy talked about in the new medical school showed that people aren't paying attention. Interestingly, I think if we did a follow-up study of the previous 185 schools, we would see a significant change. I got to know personally of several schools that change the technical standards. It's very difficult to change perceptions, and I think it's going to take time. I think just focusing on the functional aspect of it. Can the applicant gather the information, and does the applicant have the ability for intellectual capacity to analyze the information and make appropriate decisions? That's really what it comes down to. So, and the deaf and hard of hearing where there's one veterinarian who is amazing. She listens to her sound totally by palpation, and she's been very accurate. There's a pediatrician who uses an oscilloscope and looks at the noise he hears in the heart because he can't hear anything in the stethoscope. They're amplified stethoscopes. There are many different options available. So it's not you must hear it, can you get the information and analyze it? I think that's really the bottom line.
Absolutely, Dr. Zazove. I do also want to highlight that on the Docs with Disabilities website, which is docswithdisabilities.org, there's more information that will be coming forward soon, but we are doing technical standards webinars with the AACN, the Association of American Colleges of Nursing. Apologies if that was not quite right, but and then similarly one for pharmacy as well. And we recently completed one for veterinary medicine. So there will be some more particularly focused conversations on technical standards coming forth as well. One other question just came in the Q&A. Do you recommend all students, including those with accommodations, attest to being able to meet the technical standards each year?
Katy, you want to answer that?
I'm happy to give my opinion. I don't personally use accommodations at this point, so I'm happy to defer if you have more lived experience with that.
I am not aware of people being asked to do this every year. Maybe some schools they do. I was never asked every year to do it. Once I got in medical school, it was just that was it. So, other medical schools that ask people to whether they meet the technical standards every year?
I know that for me personally, as someone who uses accommodations, I was not asked to answer them every year. But when I did have to answer them, I was very aware that I would be using accommodations to succeed in medical school, and also that I wouldn't be allowed to start medical school if I didn't sign them. And so I personally chose to sign them and to push forward with receiving accommodations, knowing that it was absolutely my right to have accommodations and to succeed in the way that I knew I could in medical school. So that is more of an opinion than anything else, but I would say, yes, know that you have the right to accommodations, and your school should be working with you to accommodate you properly, even after signing the technical standards. Several things coming in the Q&A, just sort of as we were talking about that. Someone added, I believe it's currently an LCME requirement to have them signed. Someone else added, this can be important because student situations can change from year to year. And then finally, it is in fact the current expectation of the LCME that students attest every year. Schools are being cited, but that expectation is not formally stated in the LCME definition or data collection instrument. It sounds like there may broadly be a little bit of confusion around the requirements and the practice for this.
Yeah,
Those are currently all of the questions that are present. Anything the two of you would like to add?
I have one thing I think it'd be worth highlighting. When the ADA first came out, there were a lot of students who sued the medical school for lack of accommodation. And between the ADA coming out in the early 90s and the rest of the 90s and the first part of the 2000s, the medical schools won most cases. The ADA Amendment Act, which is an update of the ADA that came out in 2008, made it more explicit that the schools, in our case, the schools provide accommodation. Since then, most of the lawsuits that have gone to court have been in favor of the student. So medical schools who don't comply with the technical standards, i.e. functional technical standards, are at risk of significant lawsuits and losing. I just want to highlight that because I think people often don't realize that.
I would share too. I think, there may be schools or programs that are reticent to change their technical standards, but I think a lot of them is a lack of awareness, even despite the vast resources that are now available. And sometimes it takes one person to kind of champion a change. For example, I mentioned my own medical school was a new school in the 2022 study. And our technical standards were graded as equivocal. So not particularly restrictive, but also not particularly welcoming or accommodating. And after we published a study and it was brought to the attention of my own medical school, they updated their technical standards to be more welcoming and to use really supportive language. And so I think that was just a case of nobody had been looking at it. It hadn't been brought up before, but once it was brought up and the resources were shared, then they were more than willing to make the change. And so I think, I would encourage those listening, if your school is maybe in a position where the technical standards aren't as inclusive, but if you can share some of these resources, that can be a good impetus for change as well.
I think that is a perfect concluding statement, that we know technical standards are important and need to be updated, and all of us can push forward in our own institutions to make them more inclusive. Dr. Stauffer, Dr. Zazove, thank you so much for sharing your research and your thoughts with us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Zoe. Dr. Sheets.